The mediator pattern defines an object, called the mediator, that describes how a set of objects interact with each other, therefore reducing lots of chaotic dependencies between those objects. So let's go through an example so that you can understand the mediator pattern in an easy, intuitive way. So let's say that we have a blog that lists all of your blog posts, and you can select a post, then edit that post title. So you can see here initially when the page loads, we have state 1, where we have a sort of list of blog posts, and none of those posts are initially selected. So that's the initial state, no posts are selected. And then the user can select an article from the posts container. So this is the post container, and in this case they've just selected post 3, and a sort of text input is then populated on the right hand side of the screen with the title of the post. And then the save button becomes enabled, so the user can then update the title of that post within this text box. And the save button is disabled if no title is provided. So if the user deletes all of the characters from this text box, then the post button is disabled, and also if no post is selected, then the save button is also disabled. So you can see here the save button is disabled because no title is provided. So we need some components for this application. So first of all, we have a list box that contains the posts. So this is the list box. Then we have a text box for editing the title, and a button that can either be disabled or enabled. And the above classes, list box, text box, and button, will come from a UI framework, so we do not have access to the source code to these UI components. Again, when an article is selected from the list box, the text box should be populated and the button enabled, and when we clear the text box, the button should become disabled. So the question becomes, how do these classes talk to each other? So they should be able to, ideally, be able to talk to each other without knowledge of each other. And one solution would be to use inheritance. So we can see here at the top we have our UI framework classes that we cannot touch, so we don't have access to these. This is just like an installed package. And we have a list box, text box, and a button class. And then we can extend each of those classes to create our own sort of custom versions of these classes. So we can extend list box to create our own post list box class. Then we have a title text box, which extends or inherits from text box, and same again for button, for the save button. And then these sort of custom classes that extend the UI library classes can then talk to each other like this. So we can see here that posts list box holds a reference to the title text box. Then we can create an onSelect method, so that when a post is selected from the list, it calls, it sets the text on the text box and enables the save button. And then within title text box, we have an onChange method. So whenever the user types some characters into the box or deletes some characters, we check to see if the text is an empty string, and if it is, we disable the save button. And we can see in save button, it holds a reference to the title text box, because when the button is clicked, if the button is enabled, then it will get the text from the text box and save it to the database. Okay, so the problem with this solution is that as our form gets more complex, there becomes lots of dependencies or connections between these classes, and also the logic for this form is spread all over the place. It's spread between all of these classes. So to see what's going on in this form, you have to look at multiple classes, and it's very difficult to understand and maintain. So we can solve this problem using the mediator pattern. And using the mediator pattern, the UI components don't need to know about each other, as all of the interaction logic is in this dialog box, which is the mediator. So whenever a UI component changes, it notifies its owner, which is the dialog box, by calling the changed method and passing itself So each of these components are UI control components, and it passes itself as an argument to this change method, which then handles updating all of the other components. So this will make a lot more sense as we implement this in code. So let's go ahead and do that. So I've created a new folder called Mediator, and then first of all we're going to create our dialog box Mediator class. Okay, so this class plays the role of mediator. So every time a UI component changes its state, it will call its group's dialog box. So this is actually going to be an abstract class, so let's change that to abstract. And we're going to provide a public abstract method called changed that will take a UI control or UI component. And this hasn't been created yet, so we are getting an error. And you might be wondering why this is actually an abstract class and not an interface. And that is because in a real GUI framework, we would provide some concrete methods as well as these abstract methods. So that is why I've created this as an abstract class. So next up, let's create this abstract UI control class. So the abstract UI control class is going to ensure that each UI component gets put into a dialog box, and a dialog box is essentially just a group of UI components. So we're going to need a field called dialog of type dialog box, and we're going to call this owner. So all UI components can be grouped into a dialog box and know and can talk to their owner. So this allows the owner to change other UI components accordingly. So all UI control components need a single dialog box or mediator owner. And we can now create a constructor here where we can pass the owner to the UI control. So we're specifying which class should be the owner. Okay, so now we have our UI control class. Okay, so next up we can create our concrete UI components that extend the UI control class. So first of all, I'm going to create the listbox class, and this needs to extend UI control. So let's actually generate a constructor to satisfy this UI control class. And you can see here what we are doing is we are passing a dialog box or mediator owner to the listbox constructor and setting the owner in the base UI control class. So next up, what we need to do is a listbox. We need to be able to select a post. So what we'll do is we'll just simply store a private string called selection and set that to an empty string, and then we'll create a couple of getters and setters for setting the selected post inside of the list box. So let's first of all create a getter function or getter method called getSelection, and this will just return the selection. And then we'll have a set selection, and we will set the selection. And what we need to do here is we actually need to now notify the owner that this class has changed. So if we select a title from the list box, selection will be updated, and we need to let the other components know that this class has changed. So what we do is we notify the owner by calling owner.changed, and then we pass this UI control class or object to the changed method. And then within the owner can see that this list box has changed,
and it can then update the other components, so the text box and the button, accordingly. So next up we're going to create the concrete text box class. And this is going to again extend UI control, or inherit from UI control. And then we need to generate the constructor so that it satisfies the UI control class. And text box is just going to have a simple text field. Initialized to an empty string. And then we need to create again our getters and setters for this text field. So we set the text, and again we need to notify the owner, which is a dialog box, a sort of mediator class, that this class has changed. So we call the changed method and we pass this text box object. And finally, our final concrete UI control component is the button. So let's create a class called button, and this is going to extend UI control. We then need to generate the constructor, just the same as before, and a button class just needs to store a field just to state whether the button is enabled or disabled. And we need some getters and setters for this is enabled field. And again, we need to inform the owner that the button has changed. Okay, so here again we are telling the mediator that this button object, have changed. So finally what we need to do is create the posts dialog box that's going to contain all of the UI components for our post title editing application, and it's going to update these components depending on which component called the changed method. So that's going to make more sense as we actually create this class. So we're going to create posts dialog box, and this class needs to extend dialog box. So this is kind of like our concrete mediator class. So let's implement the abstract class. So it needs to have this changed method, and what we'll do first is we will create all of our fields for all the UI components. So we need a list box, a text box, and a button. We now need a constructor so that we can pass all of our UI components to this concrete mediator, the post dialog box. So let's create a constructor. And what we're actually going to do is we're just going to initialize them inside of the constructor rather than pass them. So we'll say post listbox equals new listbox, and if you can remember, within each UI control component we need to actually pass the owner, and the owner is just going to be this. So then we do the same for all of the other components. And also in the constructor we're going to set the save button to disabled, because initially the save button needs to be disabled.
So next up, let's actually add the logic inside of our changed method. So what we need to do in here is we need to check what the UI control is. So if the UI control is equal to a posts list box, or the post list box, then what we need to do is we're going to set the title text box. So we'll say title text box dot set text, and we're going to set that equal to the posts list box dot get selection. Okay, and we also need to enable the save button. And what we should do is we should set enabled here. Okay, so you can see that if the UI control is a post list box, so if the post list box has changed, then that means that a post has been selected. So therefore we need to update the title text box with the selected post title, and we need to enable the save button. Okay, so that is pretty straightforward. Then we need another conditional to say that if the UI control is equal to a title text box, so this means that the title text box has changed, so the user has entered a title or deleted some characters from the title. So what we need to do here is we check to see if the title is empty, so we can create a boolean So here we are checking if the title text box is empty, and then what we can do is we can set we can get the save button and set enabled equal to the opposite of is title empty. So if the title is empty, then the save button will be disabled, whereas if the title isn't empty, then the save button will be enabled. Okay, so that is all the logic we need. However, you can see that this is a little bit bloated, this change method. So what we can do is we can create a couple of sort of helper methods now. So it would be nicer if we could just call handle post changed to handle the post list box changing, and sort of abstract this logic into its own separate method. So let's create a private void called handle, and let's capitalize that actually, handle post changed, and we can paste the logic down here, and let's capitalize this, and let's do the same for our text box logic. So handle title changed, and let's cut this and put it all in its own separate method. Okay, so that's a little bit tidier, much clearer what is going on here. And so now that is pretty much everything we need to do. So notice how clear it is now, because all of our business logic for our application is centered inside of this one post dialog box, our sort of concrete mediator. So our sort of logic isn't spread out over multiple UI components. So this is much more readable, much more clear what is going on. So let's now create a method inside of this post dialog box to simulate a user interaction. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a method called simulate user interaction. And what we're going to do is we're going to essentially say that the user has selected a post, and the post title is post 2, and we're going to log to the console the title inside of the text box, and we're going to check if the button is enabled. Okay, so this is just a sort of method to simulate a user interaction. So the user selects a post from the post box, and then we're just checking to make sure that the title text box is updated correctly. So this should be post 2, and we're also checking that the button is enabled. So now let's go into our program.cs file and check that this all is working correctly. So let's create a posts dialog box. And then let's simulate a user interaction and run this program. And as we can see, the title text box has been updated correctly. It has been populated to post 2, which is correct, and the button is enabled, which is perfect. So that's all working correctly. So let's also test out that the user enters no title. So if we come back to our posts dialog box and let's set the title to an empty string. So essentially the user has selected post 2 and then they have deleted the title from the post from this title input box. And then if we go to our program.cs file and run this, let's see what we get. So we can see that the title text box is empty, which is correct, and we can see that the button is no longer enabled, so that the user cannot save a post with no title. So this is all working perfectly. So here is the Gang of 4 UML for the mediator pattern. So here we have an abstract class called the mediator, and this was analogous to our dialog box class in our example. We then have a concrete mediator, so this was like our posts dialog box, which extends the mediator class. We then have an abstract class called colleague. In our case, we didn't make it abstract, and our colleague class was the UI control class. And you can see here that UI control class, or the colleague, is associated to, or sort of stores a reference to, its mediator, so its owner. And you can see here our UI control, which is our colleague, stores reference to the dialog box or its owner, which is the mediator class. Okay, we then have our concrete colleague classes. So these are, in our example, were our UI components, so text box, list box, and button. And you can see here that we then have our concrete mediator. So this was our posts dialog box, which stores reference to all of the UI components that it owns. Okay, so the concrete colleagues are all unrelated or uncoupled from each other. They talk to each other indirectly via the mediator, allowing them to be reused in different contexts. For example, we are not coupling a list box to a text box or a button. The only coupling that we have is between the concrete mediator and the concrete colleagues. And this is fine because in our example, the posts dialog box needs to know about all of its UI components so that they can interact with each other. The mediator pattern can be used with the observer pattern. So one problem with our previous solution is that the changed method on the posts dialog box can get bulky as we add more UI components, which means that we'll have lots of if-else conditional statements to see what components has changed. So you can see here this was our changed component, and we're checking what type of UI control has changed, then handling it accordingly. So you can see how this can get bulky as we have more UI controls in our dialog box. So to solve this, we can actually implement the mediator pattern using the observer pattern. So let's just remind ourselves of what the observer pattern looks like. So we have an abstract class, or which is called the subject, and this has 3 methods. So we have an attach, detach, and notify. And this subject class will sort of manage a list of observers. And then we have our concrete subject, which is the class which is being observed. We then have an observer interface, which has a single update method. And we then have our concrete observers, which implement this observer interface. And each of these observers has an update method for updating the observer whenever the concrete subject has changed. And whenever it changes, the concrete subject calls this notify method. It loops through all of the observers and calls this update method on each of the observers. So below now we have the UI controls, which are our subjects. So we have list box, text box, and button, and these are our subjects. Okay, so these are the components which are being observed, and we then have our posts dialog box in the middle here, and this is the observer. So whenever a UI control changes, the posts dialog box gets notified. So let's actually implement this in code so that it becomes clear what is going on. So I've created a new folder called Mediator with Observer, where we're going to create our new solution with the observer pattern. So let's also create a folder called UI Framework, and this is essentially going to be the code that we would not have access to within our application. So it's some sort of UI library that we have installed. And within here, I'm going to create a delegate called Event Handler. So I'm going to first of all create this as a class, and then we will modify it into a delegate. So let's remove all of this. And this needs to be a delegate. And we need to return void. So in C# we can use delegates to specify what an event handler or a callback method should look like. So here we're saying that event handler methods should return void and receive no arguments. And just stick with me because this doesn't really make much sense just yet, but it will make more sense as we develop this solution further. So next we're going to create the UI control class, which is our subject class from the observer pattern. So let's just extend this out a little bit. And we're going to create a class called UI control. And yeah, as I said, this is the subject class from the observer pattern. So this is going to basically manage our event handlers. So it's going to keep a list of callback methods for updating the other UI components when a user interacts with them. So let's create a list of event handlers. And we're going to need a method for adding event handlers to this list. Okay, so we add the event handler onto the list, and we also need a method for notifying the event handlers, or calling the event handlers, I should say. So we're going to call this notify event handlers, and we are going to loop through all of the event handlers, and we're just going to simply invoke each event handler method. Okay, so let's just call this handler. Okay, so just to sort of explain what we're doing here, so each UI component is going to extend this UI control class, meaning that we can add certain event handlers to each UI control component. And whenever, so for example, the posts list box, what we can do is we can give it or add an event handler to this component, and then whenever the post is selected, we can call this notify event handlers method, which loops through all of the methods and calls them. So in our case, the posts, whenever a post is selected from the post list box, it should update the title
text box and enable the button. So again, this is going to make more sense a little bit further down the line, so just stick with me for now. So now what we're going to do is we're going to create our concrete UI components. So first of all, let's create the list box. And this needs to extend UI control. And now what I'm going to do is just copy and paste the code that we essentially had before. So here we have our selected post, we have our getter, and we have our setter. And whenever we set the selection, we are calling this notify event handlers method, which we get from UI control. So now let's create our text box. And again, we inherit from UI control. And I'm just going to copy and paste this in because, again, it's the same as what we had beforehand. Okay. So again, we can set the text, get the text, and whenever we set the text, we are going to notify the event handlers that have been attached to text box. And our final concrete UI component, the button class, which inherits again from UI control. And again, I'm just going to copy and paste this in because it is the same as what we had beforehand. Okay. So again, we have our set enabled method, which notifies the event handlers or invokes the event handlers that are attached to the button. Okay, so now that is basically all of the code that we need for our UI framework, or the code that we have basically downloaded or installed that we don't have access to. So now we can actually create our custom code, which is going to be our posts dialog box. So this is essentially now our application. So we've basically installed this framework, and now we are going to use this framework. So in posts dialog box, so I just want to mention actually before we create any more code, that post dialog box is now going to be both a mediator containing all of the business logic for how UI components should interact with each other, as well as being an observer which receives notice whenever a UI component changes. So it's now both a mediator and an observer. So first of all, let's declare the fields for the UI components. And we can see here we need to import these classes from our UI framework folder. And then I'm going to create a constructor where we can initialize these fields. Okay. And now what we need to do is we need to add our event handler methods to each UI component. So before we do that, we actually want to add our methods for handling events. So if we have a look at what we did before in the mediator example, if we go to our posts dialog box, we have our handle post changed method, and we also have a handle title change method. So let's copy and paste those in. Okay, because these are going to now be our event handlers, okay, that we can attach to each of these UI components. So now what we can do is we can call posts list box, add an event handler, and the event handler that we want to add is the handle post change event handler. Or let's give it a better name of post selected. Okay. And let's also add
an event handler to the title text box, and I'm going to change this to title changed. Okay, so that's pretty clear what's going on here. So as you can see, if we compare this to beforehand, in our post dialog box, we had to check which UI control had changed, whereas now, because we are just adding event handlers to each of the UI controls, we no longer need to check which UI control has changed. So it's a lot tidier. And as we add more components, this is going to be a lot cleaner than the solution that we had beforehand. So now what we can do is add a method to simulate a user interaction. So let me copy and paste that in to save some time. So here we go. So what we're doing here is we are simulating a post being selected from the post list box, and we're then going to log out to check whether the title text box and the button has been updated correctly. So now let's go into our program.cs file and test all of this out. So let's create a posts dialog box. And this should be posts dialog box. Mediator with observer. And we then need to simulate a user interaction, so we can call that method. And then we can run the program to test that all of the components have been updated correctly. And as we can see here, the title text box is post 2 and the button is enabled. So let's come back into our post text box now and basically simulate the user deleting the title and check that our other components have been updated correctly. So as you can see, the title text box is now empty and the button enabled is false, which is exactly as it should be. So let's now just take a quick look at what we have done to summarize what is going on here. So you can see here in our post dialog box constructor that we set our components equal to our UI components, and then we are adding event handlers to each of the UI components. So let's have a look at this post list box. We add an event handler called post selected, and if we take a look inside of our list box, we can see that whenever we set a selection, we are calling the notify event handlers method, which comes from this UI control component, and this method loops through all of the event handlers that we attached. And if you remember, in post dialog box we just attach this post selected method, and what we do is this method is then invoked. So you can see here we call this method, and this method then updates the title text box and the save button accordingly. So this is great because we have now combined the mediator pattern with the observer pattern and reduced the ugly bulky conditionals that we previously had in the post dialog box.